Imagine an entire nation's navy, sailed by its own sailors, burned to the waterline by its own captains. Not because the enemy sank them, but because the men in charge were too afraid, too proud, and too slow to save them. This is not a story about a battle lost in glorious combat. This is a story about the single worst naval disaster in American history before Pearl Harbor, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. 19 warships, 20 transport vessels, over 2,000 men, sent to destroy a small British fort manned by 700 soldiers in a war where the young United States desperately needed a victory. What happened instead would bankrupt an entire state, destroy the reputations of a founding father silversmith friend, and end with the American commander burning his own fleet with his own hands rather than let the British have it. If you think you know the American Revolution, you have never heard this story, because for 200 years, nobody wanted to tell it. Stay with me, because by the end of this hour, you will understand why the Penobscot expedition should be taught in every classroom in America, and why it almost never is. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with a simple fact. Most of us grew up learning the American Revolution as a story of underdog triumph. Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Valley Forge, Yorktown. A tidy narrative of hardship followed by eventual victory, culminating in independence. But wars are never that clean. Wars are made of hundreds of smaller campaigns, most of which never make it into a textbook. And some of those forgotten campaigns are forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because they were embarrassing. The Penobscot expedition is the most spectacular example of this kind of erased history in the entire Revolutionary War. It was, at the time it launched, the single largest amphibious military operation the fledgling United States had ever attempted, and it ended in complete and total ruin. Every ship lost, hundreds of men dead, a state's treasury gutted, and two names, one of them among the most famous in all of American history, dragged through a court of inquiry in disgrace. So let's build this story properly, from the ground up, because the details matter more than you think. To understand the Penobscot expedition, you first have to understand where the war stood in the summer of 1779. This is the fourth year of fighting. The Declaration of Independence is 3 years old. The alliance with France has been signed, and French support, both financial and eventually military, is beginning to reshape the strategic balance of the war. But in 1779 specifically, that French support has not yet translated into decisive victories on the ground. The war in the South is intensifying, with the British shifting strategic focus toward Georgia and the Carolinas, believing correctly that Loyalist sentiment ran stronger there. In the North, the major armies under Washington and the British commanders in New York are locked in a kind of exhausted stalemate, neither side able to land a knockout blow. It is in this uneasy middle period of the war, this stretch where neither side has clear momentum, that the British High Command in North America makes a decision that will trigger one of the most dramatic and least remembered campaigns of the entire conflict. The British plan centers on a stretch of coastline that, in 1779, is not yet the state of Maine. It is simply the easternmost, most sparsely populated frontier of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a rugged coastline of deep bays, rocky peninsulas, and old-growth forest that had been fought over by European powers for more than a century before the Revolution even began. The British target this region for very specific, very practical reasons, and understanding those reasons is essential to understanding everything that follows. First, there is timber. The Royal Navy's entire global power depends on a steady supply of tall, straight pine trees for ship masts, and the forests of what is now Maine contained some of the best mast timber anywhere in North America. Losing access to New England's white pine forest during the war had already strained British naval logistics. Second, there is geography. A fortified British position on Penobscot Bay would sit almost exactly halfway between British-occupied New York and British-held Nova Scotia, giving the Royal Navy a critical resupply and refuge point along a coastline that had until now been entirely hostile to British ships. Third, and this reason gets less attention than it deserves, there is the question of loyalist refugees. Thousands of American colonists had remained loyal to the Crown throughout the rebellion, and many of them had been persecuted, driven from their homes, and stripped of property by their patriot neighbors. British planners envisioned Penobscot as the seed of an entirely new, loyal colony to be named New Ireland, a haven where these displaced loyalists could resettle under the protection of British arms. It was, in essence, an attempt to carve a permanent piece of loyal territory directly out of the most rebellious colony in North America. To execute this plan, the British dispatched Brigadier General Francis Maclean, a Scottish career officer with decades of military experience, along with a garrison force generally cited between 600 and 900 men, depending on the specific muster counted by historians, drawn primarily from Scottish regiments. Maclean's convoy, escorted by a small squadron of Royal Navy sloops, landed at a peninsula called Majabiguadus in mid-June of 1779. The name Majabiguadus comes from the Abenaki language, and the site itself had long been recognized by both indigenous peoples and European colonizers as a naturally strong defensive position, a peninsula jutting into Penobscot Bay with high ground overlooking the harbor entrance. Maclean's men began construction almost immediately on a fortification they named Fort George, a name chosen, obviously, in honor of the reigning British monarch. But construction of an 18th-century fort was slow, labor-intensive work, requiring the felling of trees, the digging of ditches, the raising of earthen ramparts reinforced with logs. And Maclean, ever the professional soldier, understood exactly how vulnerable his position was in those early weeks. He knew that if the rebels responded quickly and in force, his half-built fort and undermanned garrison would have little chance of holding out. And the rebels did respond, though perhaps not quite as quickly as the moment demanded. Word of the British landing reached Boston within days, carried by coastal traders and fishermen who had witnessed the British ships entering Penobscot Bay. The reaction among Massachusetts's political and military leadership was immediate alarm, bordering on outright panic. This was not some distant, abstract threat. This was a British military foothold being constructed inside Massachusetts' own claimed territory, less than 150 miles from Boston itself, the very cradle of the rebellion. If the British were allowed to complete Fort George unmolested, Massachusetts leaders feared it would become a permanent thorn in their side, a base from which the Royal Navy could raid coastal shipping, resupply loyalist militias, and project power up and down the New England coastline for the remainder of the war and potentially long after. So the General Court of Massachusetts, the colony's governing legislative body, made a decision that, in hindsight, reveals both the ambition and the overconfidence of the moment. Rather than requesting assistance from the Continental Congress or from General Washington's Continental Army, Massachusetts decided to mount the expedition almost entirely on its own authority, using its own state resources, its own state Navy vessels, and a substantial number of privately owned privateer ships whose captains were enticed to join by promises of prize money from captured British vessels and supplies. This decision to go it alone, rather than waiting for coordinated federal support, would later be cited by historians as one of several structural weaknesses baked into the expedition from its very conception. The fleet Massachusetts assembled truly was extraordinary for its time, and it is worth pausing to appreciate just how large a commitment this represented for a single colony, still in the middle of fighting a war for its survival. Numbers vary slightly between historical sources, which is common for military records from this era, but the general consensus places the total fleet at somewhere between 39 and 44 vessels. Of these, roughly 19 were dedicated warships, ranging from smaller sloops and brigs up to larger frigates, carrying a combined total of approximately 344 cannons across the fleet. To put that cannon count in perspective, this was, at the moment it sailed, larger in raw firepower than anything the Continental Navy itself, the young nation's official naval force, had ever assembled in a single operation up to that point in the entire war. Alongside the warships sailed roughly 20 transport vessels, tasked with carrying troops, artillery, supplies, and equipment. Aboard this combined fleet were somewhere between 340 and 400 Continental Marines, and a land force of militia infantry generally cited between 800 and 1,200 men, drawn primarily from Massachusetts County militias hastily mobilized for the campaign. This was, in every practical sense, overwhelming force. Against McLean's 600 to 900 defenders working behind half-finished earthworks, the Americans were bringing several times that number in trained militia alone, backed by a battle fleet, with more cannons than the British had defending the entire bay. On paper, this should not have been a close contest. And this is precisely what makes the outcome so devastating to examine, because the disaster that followed cannot be blamed on a lack of resources, a lack of numbers, or a lack of initial opportunity. It can only be explained by failures of leadership, coordination, and decisiveness, human failures made by human beings at the worst possible moments. Now, let's talk about the men who commanded this expedition, because the command structure itself is really the hidden villain of this entire story. Naval command of the fleet was given to Commodore Dudley Saltonstall. Saltonstall came from a prominent and politically well-connected Connecticut family, with relatives who held significant influence in both Connecticut and continental political circles. He was an experienced sailor by the standards of the time, having commanded vessels earlier in the war, and he carried himself, by nearly every contemporary account, with considerable personal pride and a strong sense of his own authority and judgment. But experience and confidence are not the same thing as boldness, and it is boldness, specifically, that this mission demanded above all else. Saltonstall's temperament, as would become brutally clear over the following weeks, leaned heavily toward caution, deliberation, and a reluctance to commit his forces to decisive action until conditions felt, in his own judgment, entirely favorable. In a campaign where speed was everything, where every day of delay handed the enemy more time to strengthen an unfinished fort, this temperament would prove catastrophic. Command of the land forces, the militia infantry, who would actually storm ashore and assault Fort George directly, was given to Brigadier General Solomon Lovell. Lovell stood in almost total contrast to Saltonstall. He was widely regarded by his contemporaries, and by later historians, as courageous, energetic, and consistently eager to press forward with aggressive action against the British position. Lovell understood, seemingly better than anyone else in the senior command structure, that time was the expedition's most precious and most perishable resource. Nearly every major decision point in this campaign would find Lovell pushing for immediate, decisive assault, and Saltonstall counseling delay, caution, and further deliberation. And then there is the third figure in this command triangle, a name that will stop you in your tracks the first time you hear it in this context. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere. Yes, the same Paul Revere, immortalized in American memory for his midnight ride in April of 1775, warning colonial militia of the approaching British regulars before the battles of Lexington and Concord. By 1779, Revere held a commission in the Massachusetts militia and had been placed in command of the expedition's artillery train, a role that made him responsible for the cannons that would need to be transported by ship, landed under fire, hauled up steep terrain, and positioned to bombard Fort George into submission. Revere was, by profession, a silversmith and engraver, a skilled craftsman and prominent Boston tradesman with genuine revolutionary credentials. But he was not, prior to this campaign, an officer with extensive combat command experience at this scale. His performance during the Penobscot expedition and the controversy that followed it would come to occupy years of his life and would very nearly define his historical legacy in a dramatically different, far less flattering light than the one in which we remember him today. So here is the command structure that Massachusetts sent north into this critical campaign. A commodore in charge of the fleet who was fundamentally cautious and hesitant to commit to bold naval action. A general in charge of the land troops who was aggressive and eager to strike immediately. And an artillery commander, one of the most famous tradesmen in colonial Boston, managing the guns that both men desperately needed to succeed. Critically, and this cannot be overstated, there was no single overall commander with authority over both the naval and land components of the expedition. Lovell could plan and propose the boldest assaults imaginable, but without Saltonstall's ships to transport troops, provide covering bombardment, and neutralize the small British naval squadron guarding the harbor, Lovell's hands were effectively tied. This divided command structure, this absence of one unified voice with final authority to order decisive action and enforce it, stands today as one of the most frequently cited structural causes of the disaster that followed. Historians studying this campaign consistently point to this single organizational flaw as being every bit as damaging as any individual officer's personal failings. The fleet departed Boston Harbor in mid-July of 1779, sailing north and east along the increasingly rugged and sparsely settled Maine coastline. The voyage itself took several days, giving the men aboard time to speculate, to prepare their weapons, and, for the militia infantry in particular, to steel themselves for what many believed would be a swift and relatively straightforward victory against an undermanned, half-built enemy position. When the fleet finally arrived off Majabiguadus around July 24th and 25th, what they saw must have been, in a strange way, both encouraging and slightly unsettling. Encouraging, because Fort George was exactly as incomplete as intelligence reports had suggested, still little more than earthworks and log palisades in places barely waist-high, with entire sections of the perimeter essentially undefended by any substantial fortification at all. Unsettling, perhaps, because the sheer scale of the American fleet arrayed against this modest British position must have made the coming engagement feel, to some aboard those ships, almost like overkill. If the Americans had struck immediately, with the full weight and speed that their overwhelming numbers allowed, most military historians who have studied this campaign agree that the British position could very plausibly have fallen within days, and quite possibly within hours of a truly committed, coordinated assault. General McLean himself, in accounts and correspondence recorded both during and after the campaign, expressed serious doubt that his position could have withstood a determined immediate attack. He had, by his own later admission, prepared himself and his officers for what he genuinely expected to be a losing defense against the scale of force arrayed against them. This was the moment. This was the narrow window during which the entire outcome of this campaign hung in the balance, and it began closing almost immediately, not because of British resistance, but because of American hesitation. The Americans did land troops on July 25th and 26th, and here I want to be fair to the militia soldiers and to General Lovell specifically, because the initial landing itself was, by any honest military assessment, a genuinely impressive feat of arms. American troops were required to scale steep, difficult, heavily wooded cliffs along the peninsula's shoreline under active enemy fire in order to establish their initial beachhead. This assault, which some military historians have since described as one of the more daring and technically difficult amphibious landings of the entire Revolutionary War, succeeded in driving back British forward pickets and firmly establishing American forces on the peninsula itself, within direct striking distance of the still unfinished fort. Casualties were taken on both sides during this landing, and by every contemporary account available to us, the militia troops who carried out this assault fought with genuine courage and discipline under extremely difficult physical conditions. Whatever failures would come later in this campaign, they cannot fairly be laid at the feet of the common soldiers who scaled those cliffs under fire on July 25th. But having achieved this hard-won foothold, the entire operation ground to a halt, and it stalled for one specific identifiable reason. General Lovell needed the fleet, needed Saltonstall's ships, to either destroy the small British naval squadron sheltering in the harbor, which consisted of only a handful of Royal Navy sloops, dramatically outnumbered by the American fleet, or at absolute minimum, to move in and provide direct naval bombardment support against Fort George, while Lovell's infantry pressed their assault from the landward side. And Commodore Saltonstall simply would not commit his ships to this action. Day after day, General Lovell pressed his naval counterpart for support. Day after day, formal councils of war were convened aboard the American flagship, where officers debated strategy, argued over risk, and repeatedly failed to reach the kind of decisive consensus the moment demanded. Saltonstall raised concern after concern. He worried about potential damage to his ships from the British squadron's guns, however outmatched that squadron clearly was. He worried about unknown shore batteries that might be hidden along the harbor's edges. He worried, according to testimony later given by his own subordinate officers, about risks that many of those same officers considered minor, manageable, and entirely acceptable given the overwhelming advantage the Americans held in every meaningful category of military strength. This delay did not last a day, or even a few days. It stretched on agonizingly for nearly 3 full weeks. What had begun as a promising, well-resourced campaign against a genuinely vulnerable target slowly transformed, day by day, into a grinding, static siege that favored nobody so much as it favored the British, who used every single day of American hesitation to further strengthen Fort George's defenses. General Lovell's land forces, dug into positions on the peninsula, began to suffer increasingly from the practical hardships of prolonged campaigning far from proper supply lines. Dwindling provisions, the spread of disease through crowded, unsanitary camp conditions, and perhaps most corrosively, a steadily eroding sense of morale as soldiers watched what should have been a swift, decisive victory dissolve day by day into an increasingly uncertain and drawn-out standoff. Paul Revere, throughout this frustrating stalemate, continued working diligently to keep the expedition's artillery positioned, supplied, and operationally ready, hauling guns into position along the high ground overlooking the fort, coordinating with Lovell's infantry commanders on potential bombardment plans. But even the most skillfully managed artillery train in the world cannot force a fortified position to surrender without the kind of sustained, coordinated bombardment that only a genuine combined arms assault, land and sea working in concert, could realistically provide. And that coordinated assault never came, because it required ships that Saltonstall would not send. Every single day this standoff continued. General McLean's men used the time to strengthen Fort George's walls, deepen its surrounding ditches, reinforce weak points in the perimeter, and improve sight lines for their own limited artillery. The window that had been standing wide open on the morning of July 25th, when Fort George was little more than a half-built collection of earthworks manned by a nervous, undermanned garrison, was narrowing hour by hour, day by day, as August wore on. By the second week of August, that window was nearly shut entirely, and the fort that had once seemed almost defenseless now presented a genuinely formidable obstacle to any assault, land or sea. And then, on August 13th, 1779, the entire strategic situation collapsed in an instant. A British relief fleet appeared on the horizon of Penobscot Bay. Sir George Collier, a Royal Navy Commodore operating out of New York, had assembled a powerful squadron specifically tasked with breaking the American siege at Penobscot, and he sailed north with a force that included several ships of the line and heavy frigates, vessels that dramatically outgunned and outclassed a significant portion of the American fleet, particularly the smaller, lighter-armed privateer vessels that made up such a substantial part of Saltonstall's overall command. When Collier's sails were first spotted on the horizon, the entire American operation, which had already been crippled by weeks of paralyzing indecision, dissolved almost instantly into outright chaos. What followed over the next several days has been described again and again by naval historians as one of the single most disorganized, humiliating, and comprehensively catastrophic retreats in the entire history of the United States Navy. Saltonstall, who had proven himself so agonizingly paralytically cautious when facing a weak, unfinished fort defended by a handful of small British ships, now found himself facing a genuinely superior naval force. And there was no longer any time remaining for careful deliberation, councils of war, or measured strategic debate. The American fleet, rather than making an organized, disciplined withdrawal toward open water and potential safety, instead fled up the Penobscot River itself, moving away from the open sea and into increasingly narrow, shallow, unfamiliar waters. A decision that effectively trapped much of the fleet with a determined, well-organized British squadron in active pursuit behind them. Ship after American ship ran aground on unfamiliar shoals. Ship after ship was overtaken and captured outright by pursuing British vessels. And ship after ship was deliberately set ablaze by its own crew, a desperate, heartbreaking measure taken specifically to prevent valuable vessels, cannons, and supplies from falling intact into British hands. Sailors and militia soldiers alike, having lost their ships entirely, were forced to abandon their vessels and make their way overland through more than 100 miles of dense, largely trackless Maine wilderness, attempting to reach the nearest American-held settlements on foot. This overland retreat proved every bit as brutal, and in some ways more deadly, than the naval disaster that preceded it. An exhausting, disorganized trek through unfamiliar forest terrain that claimed additional lives to exposure, starvation, disease, and sheer physical exhaustion among men who had already endured weeks of grueling siege warfare before this final desperate flight even began. By the time the smoke finally cleared along the banks of the Penobscot River, the results were almost impossible to comprehend. Of the entire Massachusetts fleet, every single American vessel was lost, every single one. Depending on which historical source you consult, somewhere between 39 and 44 ships were either burned by their own crews, run aground and abandoned, or captured outright by pursuing British forces. Not one American warship escaped this campaign to fight again. This remains, to this day, one of the only instances in the entire history of American naval warfare where an entire fleet assembled for a single campaign was completely and totally destroyed. Estimates of the human cost vary somewhat between historical sources, a common challenge when working with military records this old, but historians generally place total American casualties, combining killed, wounded, and missing, somewhere in the range of several hundred men, a devastating toll made significantly worse by the sheer number of men who died not in the heat of direct combat, but during the desperate, disorganized overland retreat through the Maine wilderness that followed the naval collapse. British losses, by stark and almost unbelievable contrast, were remarkably light throughout the entire campaign, frequently cited in historical accounts as fewer than a few dozen total casualties, an almost impossible disparity for what had begun just 3 weeks earlier as an overwhelming American numerical and firepower advantage. The financial cost of this disaster was every bit as staggering as the human and material cost. Massachusetts had invested enormous sums of money, outfitting, provisioning, and crewing this expedition, and the total loss of the entire fleet, combined with the various financial reparations, debts, and obligations that followed in its wake, is frequently cited by historians as costing the state somewhere in the range of $7 million in the currency values of the time, an almost unfathomable financial burden for a single colony to absorb, particularly one already straining under the broader economic pressures of fighting a prolonged war for independence. Some historians have argued persuasively that this catastrophic financial loss contributed meaningfully to genuine economic strain within Massachusetts for years following the disaster, a fiscal wound that took a very long time indeed to properly heal. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, the search for accountability began almost immediately, and it was Commodore Dudley Saltonstall who bore the overwhelming brunt of the blame. A formal court of inquiry was convened to examine the conduct of the expedition's senior officers, and the conclusions reached regarding Saltonstall were damning in the extreme. He was found guilty of having conducted the campaign in a manner that reflected, in the formal language of the time, cowardice and a fundamental lack of decisive judgment befitting an officer of his rank and responsibility. He was formally dismissed from the Continental Navy entirely and never again held any significant naval command. For the remainder of the war, his once promising career effectively ended by 3 catastrophic weeks of hesitation and delay off the coast of Maine. And what of Paul Revere, the man whose name is far more familiar to modern audiences than either Saltonstall's or Lovell's? Here the story takes a turn that genuinely surprises most people who know Revere only through the lens of his famous midnight ride. Revere was also formally accused of serious misconduct during the chaotic retreat, facing allegations that included insubordination toward his superior officers, cowardice under fire, and even more damningly, an accusation that he had abandoned his post during the retreat and commandeered a boat for his own personal escape before properly securing his men, his artillery equipment, and his overall command responsibilities. Revere was formally arrested and relieved of duty shortly after the expedition's collapse, and it took years, not months but genuine years, for him to finally clear his name of these serious accusations. He repeatedly petitioned Massachusetts authorities for a formal court-martial, specifically so that he could properly defend himself and prove his innocence through official military proceedings, rather than simply living under a permanent cloud of public suspicion. It was not until 1782, a full 3 years after the Penobscot disaster, that a military court finally examined the full body of evidence and testimony surrounding the charges against him and formally acquitted Paul Revere of all wrongdoing, concluding definitively that he had, in fact, conducted himself appropriately and honorably, given the genuinely chaotic and rapidly deteriorating circumstances of the retreat. Still, for those 3 long years, one of the men who would eventually become among the most celebrated and mythologized figures of the entire American Revolution carried the heavy stain of Penobscot, a stain that history has since almost entirely forgotten, but which very nearly came to define his legacy in an entirely different, far less flattering light than the one in which we remember him today. So why, given the sheer scale of this disaster, does almost nobody know this story? Why isn't the Penobscot expedition taught alongside Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown in American history classrooms across the country? I think part of the answer is simply that history, as a cultural practice, tends to remember victories far more vividly and far more readily than it remembers defeats, especially defeats caused primarily by the losing side's own internal failures of leadership and coordination, rather than by any particular brilliance or heroism on the part of the opposing force. There is, after all, no glorious last stand to celebrate here, no inspiring tale of a small, outnumbered force triumphing heroically against impossible odds. There is only the deeply uncomfortable historical truth that America's largest naval expedition of the entire Revolutionary War was ultimately defeated decisively and completely, primarily by its own divided command structure, its own institutional hesitation, and its fundamental inability to strike decisively at the precise moment when opportunity was most available. This is, at its core, a story about human failure, every bit as much as it is a story about warfare. And stories centered on human failure, however historically important they may genuinely be, rarely receive the kind of enthusiastic retelling that stories of triumph consistently receive. But here is precisely why this particular story matters, and why I would argue it deserves far more attention now than it has ever previously received. The Penobscot expedition stands today as a permanent, deeply sobering case study in the catastrophic real-world cost of divided leadership and hesitant decision-making under pressure. It teaches us, with brutal clarity, that overwhelming numerical superiority and material advantage mean remarkably little if the individuals commanding those advantages cannot act with genuine unity, appropriate speed, and real courage at the precise moment when decisive action is required. It reminds us that history's forgotten disasters frequently contain lessons every bit as valuable, and arguably considerably more valuable, than history's celebrated triumphs, because failure, when examined honestly and without flinching, teaches us far more about the fragile, human machinery of command, courage, and consequence than victory ever reliably does. And it reminds us, perhaps most powerfully of all, that even legendary, near-mythologized historical figures like Paul Revere were in reality complicated, flawed, entirely human beings who faced genuine accusations, genuine uncertainty, and the very real possibility that history could have remembered them in a dramatically different light if only a handful of specific details had unfolded slightly differently. The Penobscot expedition remains, to this day, widely regarded by naval historians studying the full scope of American military history as the worst American naval disaster to occur. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, a distinction that should, by any reasonable measure, command far more historical attention and public recognition than it has ever actually received. An entire fleet gone, every single vessel lost or destroyed. An entire state's treasury financially staggered for years afterward. Promising military careers permanently destroyed. Reputations placed under serious question for years on end. And men left dead in an unforgiving wilderness retreat that should never have been necessary in the first place. All of it stemming directly from 3 critical weeks in the summer of 1779, when decisive boldness was desperately needed, and that boldness, tragically, never came. So here is the question I genuinely want to leave you with today, and I mean this sincerely because I think it says something important about how any of us might respond under similar pressure. If you had been standing on the deck of Commodore Saltonstall's flagship in late July of 1779, looking out at that unfinished, barely defended British fort sitting almost helpless on the shoreline, watching your own overwhelming fleet sit idle day after day, while the enemy steadily strengthened their position right in front of your eyes, what would you have done? Would you have pushed hard for immediate, decisive action, accepting whatever calculated risk that entailed? Or would caution have felt like the fundamentally wiser, more responsible choice in the moment, right up until the point where it became catastrophically, irreversibly too late? I genuinely want you to write your honest answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I would love to know what you think you would have done, standing in Saltonstall's position, armed with the knowledge we now have about exactly how this story ultimately ended. If you found this story as gripping, as maddening, and as genuinely important as I did while researching it, do me one simple favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel is entirely dedicated to uncovering the forgotten battles, the buried disasters, and the untold stories from naval history, Air Force history, and military history, more broadly, that never quite made it into your school textbooks, but absolutely deserve to be remembered. Give this video a like if you learned something new today. Share it with someone in your life who loves history every bit as much as you clearly do. And drop a comment letting me know which forgotten battle, campaign, or military disaster you would like to see covered next on this channel. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me. It genuinely means a great deal, and I will see you in the very next one.